Hey guys! So in this video, we're going to learn about data types, variables, and constants. So just how in the English language we have characters, letters, words, we have integers, we have sentences, we have real numbers. In coding, we have data types.
So, there are 5 main data types in programming languages. They are integer, float, character, string, and boolean. So, an integer is just like a regular integer in our number system. It includes positive numbers, negative numbers, as well as the number 0. A float is a number, but it has a decimal point. So, this is kind of like real numbers in our number system. So for example, 42 would be an integer, but 42.0 would be a float. Then a character could be a letter of the alphabet, or it could be a special character. So it could be the letter A, it could be an exclamation mark, or it could even be an asterisk. And a string is a bunch of characters grouped together that form a word or a sentence or anything really. And lastly, Boolean is kind of different because I don't think there is anything like this in our language. But basically, Boolean means that it's either true or false. Something is either yes or no. It's true or false, yes, no, on or off. And there's no in between. How do we know which data is which type in Python? Well, integers and floats are written with just numbers, and if it is a float, then it also has a decimal point. Characters are placed in between two single quotes, and strings are generally placed in between two double quotes. And lastly, Boolean variables are represented by either a true with a capital T or a false with a capital F. So if I go ahead and open up a program I wrote earlier, we will be better able to understand data types. So over here, what I have done is I have written a print statement. 42 is of data type. And then I have used the type function to find out its data type and then print it in the terminal. All of this type function does is it returns the data type of the data provided in the parentheses. So in this case, I provided 42, and we both know that 42 is of type int, and it's even showing it over here in Visual Studio Code that it's of type int. So this is what the type function does, and it comes really handy when you're trying to debug or when you're trying to find the error in your program, or if terminal keeps throwing an error at you that it's of the wrong type and it can't perform a certain operation on your data type. It's probably because you've mistaken the type of data that you're using. The reason that it will print in the terminal is because the type function is inside the print function. So I have done this for 42, 42.0, the character and, the string A and B, and of course, the Boolean variable true. Now, one important thing to understand about Python is that it recognizes characters as strings. So, when I print this statement, it will not say that and is of type character because it recognizes all things in quotes as strings. Instead, it will print as type string. So I'm going to go ahead and press the play button and run this code. And voila. In the output, it tells me what data type each data that I provided in the parentheses is. One question that often pops up when learning data types is, why are they so important? The reason that data types are important is because once you know the data type, you can figure out what operations you can perform on it. For example, you can add integers, but you cannot add Boolean data types.
So now that we've understood what data types are, we need to understand what variables are. Think of a variable like a bucket. You can put anything inside the bucket. You could put a number in it. You could put a little character in it. You could put a string. You could put a Boolean variable. You can put pretty much anything in a bucket. You can even put a bucket inside a bucket. and that's perfectly okay. So why are variables important? Variables provide necessary data that is needed for the computer to process something. So how does this work? How do you declare a variable in code, and how do you call a variable? How do you print a variable?
Well, in order to declare a new variable in Python, it's fairly easy. You just have to type the name of the variable. So I'll call my variable num1, and then type a space, an equal sign, and the whatever you want to store in the variable. So let's say I want to store the integer 42 in it. And there you go. It's as simple as that. One really interesting thing to note about the language Python is that before you declare the variable, you don't need to declare its type, because Python treats all variables as objects. Now, this is slightly more complicated, so I will not be delving into it. But if you're interested in understanding how this works, feel free to search it up and read more about it. So coming back to variables in Python, all that this line of code does is that it stores the right-hand side value, which is 42, in the left-hand side variable, which is num1. So how do you call the variable? What if I want to print it? Well, logic says, by what we've learned so far, it should be print, open parentheses, double quotes, and then num1. But this, however, is wrong. And what will happen is, if I go ahead and run this, it'll just print num1. So the reason that it just prints num1 is because, like we discussed earlier with data types, anything in between double quotes is treated as a string. So when you put something in double quotes and then print it, it will literally print whatever you provide inside the double quotes. However, if we just go ahead and we type num1, now we are calling what is inside the variable. Think of it kind of like the bucket. I don't want to print an image off the bucket. I want to print what is inside the bucket. Therefore, I don't need the double quotes. Now if I go ahead and run it, the number 42 is printed over here. Now, let's say I want to change the value stored in the variable. Then all I have to do is call the variable again, num1, type an equal sign, and assign the new value. Now, let's say I want to assign the new value to be 0. Now, all I have to do is type the print statement again, print num1. And now if I run this, it should print 42 and then 0, meaning that num1 has been changed. And there you go, 42 and 0. So one really important thing to remember when reassigning values between variables is that if you've already assigned a type integer to the variable num1, then you can only assign an integer again to num1. It just helps maintaining consistency in the program. So you want to keep the data type of a variable constant. You don't want to assign a string to num1 and then a boolean to num1 after that, because it disrupts the consistency of the program and it makes it harder to debug and trace and all of that. Now, let's go ahead and delete all of this. And now let's say that I have two variables called num1 and num2. Num1, let's say, holds the number 42. And now what I want to do is I want to copy num1's value into num2. So all I will do is I'll say num1 equals num2. And now if I go ahead and I print it and I say num1 is num1.
So this is a complex print statement. How this works is that the string is the first thing that I want to print, and the variable num1 is the second thing that I want to print. Now, because they're two separate things, I need to separate them with a comma and a space in between. That way, the terminal or Python or computer In other words, knows how exactly to read the print statement and output the following items.
And on another line, I say num2 is num2. They both should be 42. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. Oh, look, I got an error. It says that num2 is not defined. So over here, the error that I came across was that I accidentally typed num2 instead of num1. So there we go. Now it will work. And there you go. Num1 is 42 and num2 is 42. Now, what if I change num1's value? I say that num1 is equal to 0. Now if I go ahead and I print the numbers, the value of the numbers again, but I will print a little break in between just to make it neat in terms of visuals. So now if we go ahead and print it, num2 will still retain the value of 42. Now, the reason that num2 is still 42 and it's not 0 is because num2 is an alias of num1. Referring to the bucket example, if I copied the contents of bucket 1 into bucket 2, I would not literally be putting the contents of bucket 1 into bucket 2, but rather I'd be putting a copy of the contents into bucket 2. So what the computer is doing when it executes this line of code is that it is creating a copy of the number 42 and placing it in the variable num2. So when I change the value of num1 to 0, since num1 and num2 are not linked in any way, they're merely just copies of each other, num2 retains the value 42.
Now, let's move on to constants. What are constants? Well, you can think of them like buckets where you can put anything inside. I'm putting in a number, but you can't take the number out and you can't put another number inside. You can, however, see what's inside the bucket. So constants are basically variables that cannot change, and you can only see or read data from them. You can't really write data into them. You can only write it at the start when you're declaring what the constant is. So now let's write one last program to better understand constants and how they are used in programming.
One really basic function is the swapping of values between two variables. It comes in handy when sorting a list, and it's really important to understand this concept. Let's say num1 is 42 and num2 is 100. Now I want num1 to hold 100 and I want num2 to hold 42. In other words, I want them to swap values. So the most obvious thing to do would be to run num1 equals num2 and num2 equals num1. And then we can go ahead and we can print what the numbers are by writing a print statement. And one sec. So now, if I go ahead and run this, let's go ahead and see what happens. They both say 100. So why is that? Well, as we learned earlier, when saying num1 is equal to num2, the computer is creating an alias of num2 and storing it in num1, which is in this case 100. So whatever value that num1 was pointing to is lost. And therefore, when num2 equals num1 is executed, num2 regains the value 100. So how do we fix this? We just introduce a variable called temp. We assign temp the value num1. And then we say that num1 equals num2 as normal. But at the end, we say num2 equals temp. And it would look something like this. So here we have num1, num2, and temp. So what happens is when we say temp equals num1, 42 is copied into temp. And when we say num1 equals num2, 100 is copied into num1. And when we say num2 is equal to temp, 42 is copied into num2. And that's how it works. Now if we go ahead and we run this program, it should work out. And there you go. Num1 shows as 100 and num2 shows as 42. Now, variables and constants are a crucial part of programming, and I most definitely encourage you to experiment with them. And once again, if you come across errors, Google them. You'll learn more and understand how errors work.